welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We're on to game week number 7 of this 2023 Penn State football season, and it is certainly the most notable one thus far in terms of the big picture overall. The Nittany Lions ranked number 7 right now in the AP Top 25 poll, head to take on number 3 Ohio State, noon kickoff in Columbus. Massive conference test, looking to snap a 6-game losing streak in this particular series. We'll learn a lot more about Ohio State on this episode. We figured, why wait? It's Ohio State week. We're bringing on Patrick Murphy from Bucknuts, which is the 247 Sports Ohio State site. He will give us the latest on the 6-0 Buckeyes. They're dealing with some injury issues right now. What has worked for them thus far in the season? What are the main concerns for Ohio State at 6-0? We'll learn a lot about that in just a bit. But first, let's start with Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, who have sat alongside in the Beaver Stadium press box just a couple days ago, watching Penn State absolutely dismantle UMass in a 63-0 victory. Fellas, look, they're 6-0. They've covered the spread each and every game. They're winning by an average score of 44-8 through these 6 games, and we really haven't seen much of the primary guys in the fourth quarter to this point. Mark, in some ways, it was more of the same. I'm curious, though. We'll begin, as we always do early in the week, with your feedback from the most recent game. What stood out to you from those 60 minutes of football on Saturday afternoon into the early evening?
Well, the most important thing, obviously, was they got out of it. It seemed like very healthy, outside of not having J.B. Nelson. So we'll see what's up with him as they move forward. But, to me, that was what was the first and foremost thing. Second, didn't make a ton of mistakes. I know Trey Wallace had a fumble, the first offensive turnover of the year. But in that sort of game, and, there was a goofy special teams play where they lost the ball. But overall, I thought they took care of the ball on a wet day. And then, one of the things that I think was kind of, I don't know that people talked enough about. Through the first 5 games, their special teams were so uneven. They were so up and down. And for the special teams to have that kind of day and that kind of game, obviously, Daquan Hardy with 2 punt returns for touchdowns, setting a Penn State season record. But I thought Riley Thompson had a really nice punt in bad conditions. Gabe Nwosu, obviously, I thought did a good job until the very end. The extra point stuff in bad weather was really good. They had a bit of a fluke play. I mean, Dom DeLuca deflects a punt, and it goes off of one of your downmen. I don't know what you can do about that, but I think going into the stretch run of the season, getting those special teams solidified, I thought they did a nice job of that. Whatever they did in the bye week, I thought that was really important because it's going to be critical moving ahead when these games are closer, that those units play well for you. So, offensively, I think there are still question marks about the running game. I know people took exception with me for giving the offense a B out of that game. I stand by that. I think that offense could have been even better. We didn't see the explosive plays we thought we might see. Defensively, what can you say? I mean, it's going to be fun to see what this unit's able to do against a big-time offense out at Ohio State. But overall, I just thought a really good performance and really everything you could expect in those weather conditions against that caliber of opponent coming off of a bye week and with a huge game looming.
There were some interesting personnel things that popped up coming out of the bye week. Obviously, we saw a lot of freshmen out there with the way the score went. We'll talk about some of those things in a moment, but just quickly going through a 6-game sample size here for Penn State among Big Ten peers right now on October 16th. They are number 2 in total offense right now behind Ohio State. They are number 1 in total defense ahead of Michigan. When it comes to scoring offense, they're number 1. When it comes to scoring defense, they're number 2. They are the number 1 rushing offense in yards per game. They average 203 yards on the ground per contest. They are the number 1 rushing defense in yards per game. They give up about 72 yards per game. They are the number 1 passing defense. They give about 121 yards through the air per game. And then on passing offense, they're number 7. So something that doesn't factor into the top 2 in those rankings. But, I mean, you look across the board, and it's really impressive what they've done, Daniel. And then you look at the rankings, and They had a hard time moving up. They finally get up to number 6. Now they're back down to number 7. There's things happening around them in college football. They'll be part of their own top 10 showdown this week, and I think they'll have a chance to show everybody what kind of a ranking they might deserve. But they land at number 7 in the latest AP poll. You're our point man when these rankings come out on Sunday. Can you kind of survey the hierarchy of college football mid-October and where Penn State is among that?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stands out to me in looking at these rankings is that the voters in the AP poll are rewarding teams that win big games. When Texas beat Alabama, Texas leapt up into that top 5 neighborhood. When Oklahoma beat Texas last week, Oklahoma leapfrogged Penn State in a couple polls, and then Washington beating Oregon. I mean, Oregon was another top 10 team, so you kind of knew that based on you bounce the resume of Penn State beat UMass, Washington beat Oregon. It wasn't really a surprise, but I think that for Penn State, it sets them up this week to if they want to burnish that national profile a little bit and move up. But you look at the top 5 right now, and it's been pretty steady this whole time. Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2. I thought the one thing that was interesting is that Michigan picked up 16 first place votes. Georgia only had 43. I haven't watched Georgia this year. I just see the scores, and it does seem like that this might not be the same Bulldogs team that we've seen these past couple of years. And then you go to Ohio State at number 3, Florida State, which is another one of those teams that got a big bounce after winning a big game earlier this year against LSU, and then Washington rounding out the top 5, Oklahoma in front of Penn State, and then Texas, Oregon, North Carolina rounding out that top 10. North Carolina was another team that beat Miami pretty in nice fashion and got a nice bounce up. So I think the one thing that you look at with these rankings in terms of looking way ahead is you got 5 Big Ten teams, that 5 teams that are going to be in the Big Ten in 2024 in there, which is pretty crazy to think about. But then overall, I mean, this is really it's really going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. I mean, I think that Michigan is maybe the most dominant team in the country right now. It's that whole thing with kind of like what people have talked about, like, oh, like, we want to see Penn State get tested a little bit, before you get into some of these big games. And then you look at a team like Michigan that is just steamrolling everyone. And it's like, yeah, I would prefer to have that instead of, watching a team, have to go down to the wire against an inferior opponent. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. I don't, I like looking at the polls every week because all of it is data to see where Penn State stacks up nationally, what the perception is. I looked at the poll tracker, and there's a decent number of people that have Penn State as high as number 3. A lot of people have them in the 6-7 range, and I think their low is 8 this time. So they're firmly in the top 10. I think that their resume this year has, been very valid in terms of what they've been able to do against these teams, and I think the voters, for the most part, have respected that.
In Michigan, their schedule has been much discussed. They will have bigger tests, not necessarily this week with Michigan State. That rivalry game has some of the juice out of it. I should say next week. They're in their bye week right now. But with top 25 wins, Ohio State has obviously gone on the road, beat Notre Dame. We saw USC get smoked in South Bend last week. And yet Ohio State has 1 first place vote in the AP poll. Michigan has 16 first place votes in the AP poll. You don't look at this thing in a vacuum in 2023. People know who won the last couple of Big Ten championship games, and all these teams will play each other. We got a round robin of sorts to come in October and November between Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State, potentially for the right to play Iowa in Indianapolis the first week of December, because that's how the conference works here still in 2023. But let's move aside from that conversation because, again, Penn State, Ohio State, they'll show exactly where they belong, I think, on the field in Columbus this Saturday, and the rankings next Sunday will sort things out accordingly. But, guys, as we look forward to this matchup, I think it's important to look back a little bit at UMass. It's one of those games you can skip right past because of the opponent, because of the final score, because of what lies ahead. But let's look back. Daniel and I spent about an hour on the post-game podcast, and Mark, naturally, Daquan Hardy was the talk of the town on Saturday night. What he was able to do, 2 punt returns, for touchdowns. No one's done that in a single game for Penn State. No one's returned more punts in a single season for Penn State, and he does it in his first time returning punts for the Nittany Lions. I mean, you've talked about how this guy has provided energy for the defense. He provided energy for Beaver Stadium on Saturday.
Daniel's providing energy for us, even though he's going into a coughing fit. I'm sorry, Daniel. We're all friends, so we could laugh at each other when one of us isn't feeling well. We've all gone through this, but in all seriousness, I think there are two ways of looking at Daquan Hardy as a punt returner. Number one, it was a stroke of genius to unleash him a week before Ohio State. Right. I mean, you look at it from that perspective, and it really gives the Buckeyes and their special teams something to think about. Number two, why the hell did it take them 39 games or whatever it was to put this guy as a punt returner? I mean, I know it was UMass, but wow, did he look natural back there? I get that a couple years ago you had Jahan Dotson, but there had to be somewhere along the line. I mean, I can't believe that he never returned a punt before Saturday. I scratch my head over that, and I know that they're at practice every day. They see it. They know what's going on. I completely get it. But all I know is that they've been playing football for a long time at Penn State, and the record for punt returns for touchdowns in a season is 2.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever done 2 in one game. And I just don't. I don't understand it. I don't get that end of it. But having said that, to have him in that role or as part of that role, moving forward, I think is just a really big thing. And again, I can't stress how special teams are going to be big for this team. And again, they were all over the place early in the season, and to add that sort of jolt to your special teams, I just think it is really big. And again, I get it. I get that it was UMass, and maybe they don't have the level of talent, but we heard that they have 40 transfers who have come in from other programs, a lot of them from Power 5 schools. So these weren't like a bunch of absolute schlubs out there. And for him to do that, I think that was good for the special teams. And going back to how you started what you were saying, Tyler, I just think getting him back he just has a level of energy that he brings to the entire team, and I think getting him back after he missed the first couple games.
Yep.
And the ball just seems to find him on defense. He has a knack for making plays. He's not the biggest guy, but I have to imagine pound for pound, he's one of the toughest guys on the team. He's not afraid to get into traffic. He's not afraid to hit people. And obviously when he gets the ball in his hands, he can be electric. So yeah, I think there are a couple ways of looking at that. Stroke of genius on one side. What the heck took so long on the other?
And it's funny because Terry Smith and James Franklin, whenever they talked about Daquan since he got to campus, it's always, we went to this game. He did it with the ball in his hands. He did it in so many different ways. And so just to remind people what he did as a senior at Penn Hills, where he was playing with Dante Cephas, Tank Smith, current guys on this roster. He had 10 touchdowns as a senior of 60+ yards for Penn Hills. He scored 22 total touchdowns in 5 different ways as a receiver, as a rusher. He had a pick 6. He had kickoff return, punt return. He had 10 interceptions, by the way, to go with 900 receiving yards as a senior. And as a reminder, until about 48 hours before signing day that February, this guy was probably MAC bound. And all of a sudden he is, as a year 5 guy, 3rd-year starter on defense. Terry Smith will tell everyone who will listen that he's going to be an NFL defensive back. And all of a sudden, he may be this brand new weapon that Penn State breaks out halfway home and heading to Columbus. And it feels like probably the most intriguing aspect of this return game, aside from when Micah Parsons was listed on number 1 on the depth chart in 2020, the spring, and we never got to see that materialize. The most interesting thing in the return game since maybe Saquon Barkley started fielding kickoffs. And let's remember, he took one back against Ohio State on the road that season and really sparked them early. So it's really a new storyline that I don't think a lot of us saw coming. And Daniel, beyond that, I think we were all curious to see what things would look like for this offensive front. We spent quite a bit of time on the pregame podcast wondering if Caden Wallace would end up making that move to left guard, which he's gotten some work in on the practice field. Instead, it was indeed Nick Dawkins taking the next step here. year 4 player from the same class as Olu Fashanu, has worked as the offensive, has worked as the backup center, has gotten some time at guard. He essentially stepped up and filled that rotational guard role along with Venga Ioane, who rarely left the field. I don't think any offensive lineman played more on Saturday. And then Salim Wormley at right guard. This will be interesting to see because clearly they trust Nick Dawkins, or they want to at least see what it looks like in an expanded role. Twice now this season, he's played a bunch of reps. Curious to see if this maintains in Columbus, if JB Nelson is unavailable. But I thought this was a significant answer in what Penn State plans to do, at least in the interim here, as they address some depth issues on the offensive interior.
Yeah, one last note on Daquan Hardy. It just came across while Mark was talking, but he is the Big Ten Co-Special Teams Player of the Week.
They got the co in there. Iowa, sneaky.
Tory Taylor. I mean, Tory Taylor can probably be Big Ten Special Teams Player of the Week every week, and no one would really bat an eye about that. That's the Iowa punter.
Oh, my God. Only an Iowa punter could steal the thunder away from a guy who returns 2 punts. He's the second player in the Big Ten since 2000 to return 2 punts in a game, and an Iowa punter has to come and grab a piece of that trophy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just going to be a specter of Iowa over this whole back half of the season with, for pretty much any Big Ten East team, where they're just going to be looming out there, no matter what. But yeah, I think, having Nick Dawkins, play that many reps. And I mean, I thought that he looked good. I thought it was really good to get him out there with the first team offense, or that, normal first team group early in the game. We saw him in there at center in that type of scenario against Delaware. So seeing him in there in that type of situation against at a different position at guard, I think that just shows that, he has some versatility on the interior, and that they're really committed to that rotation. We hear it all the time with these defensive ends where they're like, yeah, like we rotate all the time. And then that means when we're in the fourth quarter, we're fresh because these other, offensive linemen, they don't rotate. And I asked Venga Ioane kind of like, does that apply to you guys on offense as well? When it comes to, taking some series off, getting to watch from the sideline, getting different guys work. And, Venga agreed that, when the game is going into the stretch run, that they do feel fresher. I think overall, in terms of the big season perspective, these guys are more fresh because they've gotten to take off pretty much every fourth quarter. But then in kind of the micro in game, they're feeling more fresh down the stretch because, they're able to, sit on the sideline for a series or two, and the level doesn't necessarily drop. So, and I think just for Nick Dawkins, on the, the personal player level story, it's really cool for him. I think it's really, he's battled some injuries. It was kind of, you wanted to see if he could be a factor, for this team, and, for him to earn a spot on the 2 deep, as that, number 2 center. And now that, they're calling on him to do more with JB Nelson on the sideline, I think that's a really big positive for Penn State because it, boosts the depth. I know that we kind of talked about how we could, forecast how Penn State really had like a top 8 or 9 or 10 before the season started, and then you subtract Landon Tangwall from that. And right now, JV Nelson is subtracted from that, to be able to backfill Nick Dawkins in there and have him playing solid. I think that's really good for Penn State. So I think they're committed to rotating, especially at those guard spots. We haven't really seen, obviously we're not going to see a rotation at left tackle. And then we haven't seen a rotation at right tackle in a while. I think that bodes, really, really well, for the health and endurance of this group. And I think it's just cool to see Nick Dawkins be able to put himself in this position to contribute.
It was Caden Wallace all the way at right tackle. Again, we did see Chimdi Ono involved late, which was interesting. His second game as a true freshman here at right tackle. But along the way, Olu Fashanu, was involved in the first half and got to watch a lot of football again, which was something we saw from him earlier in non-conference action. He was a very busy man at left tackle through the first 3 Big Ten games, but watched a lot of matchups, watched a lot of reps over the first half of this season. Goes to Ohio State, about as fresh as you could possibly ask for a preseason All-American left tackle. And let's remember last year against Ohio State, when that defensive end goes off and creates havoc and ruins the day in Beaver Stadium, Olu Fashanu is on the sideline dealing with an injury, riding a stationary bike. Caden Wallace is watching that game. He was injured the week before against Minnesota. We didn't see either of those tackles the rest of the regular season. Caden Wallace surfaced as a backup in the Rose Bowl. Olu Fashanu never came back on the field. And Mark, they're both on the field. Caden Wallace is playing at a different level thus far. This will clearly be the biggest test of his senior season to date. But Olu Fashanu is in a really good position physically, you'd imagine, right now. And again, that's just a reminder of where they're at versus last year when they had half of those guys for that entire Ohio State game.
Yeah, I think it all goes back. You touched on this, but what we talked about in the preseason, or Daniel touched on it, this is why you have depth. This is why depth is important. I mean, I don't want to say that you can afford to lose guys, but if you do lose key players, you're able to have people who you can plug in. And listen, that has not been the case here. You know, with all due respect to some of the people who have had to come in and play in, the last 8 or 9 years, there have been instances where guys weren't ready to get going at that level. And I think we started to see it toward the end of last year, right? I mean, when you had a Drew Shelton come in and really start to play well toward the end of the season. But yeah, I'm really fascinated by Penn State being able to have these two starting tackles who are, obviously Olu is playing at a kind of a different level, I think, than just about everybody. But Caden Wallace, to me, I said it last week, I think he's been one of the unsung heroes of this team. I don't think he has the overall level of talent that Olu has, but very few players in the nation do. That's not a knock on Caden Wallace. This is going to be a big game for Caden because they're going to come after him, and they know that this is a situation where if you want to disrupt this Penn State offense, stopping the running game is one key, and that's what a lot of people have tried to do. But rattling Drew Aller, which nobody has been able to do yet, is going to be another key to that. And that's one of the things that obviously, getting to the quarterback last year, that Ohio State was one of the few teams that was able to do that against Penn State.
Yeah, and by the way, Penn State #1 in the Big Ten in sacks against and sacks produced. So that's a nice combination for an unbeaten team there. Daniel, let's talk about the passing game a little bit here, because when you go through and review the statistics from the UMass matchup, you may be surprised in a 63-0 game that only 5 Nittany Lions caught a pass along the way. Almost 250 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns on the ground for Penn State on Saturday. But it was Lambert Smith, as usual, leading this team in targets. The next 2 guys up were Theo Johnson and Trey Wallace, who we had waited to see take on this prominent role dating back to September 9th, the last time he really played extensively and was a full go. He's out there, 3 catches, 44 yards, along with 21. He had a fumble on his first reception. He had a drop on another early opportunity, but seemed to find his groove as the game went on. And then, obviously, Theo Johnson responded well to his opportunities. 4 catches, 66 yards, 2 touchdowns, the kind of game that we all anticipated we see from Theo going into this 2023 year. And meanwhile, Marcus Hagans really tightens things up at the wide receiver position. You saw a lot of Tyler Warren, as we would expect. He actually played more than Theo in this game. He caught his 5th touchdown of the season, which leads the team at this point. But at receiver, you had Harrison Wallace leading the group with 50 snaps, Keandre Lambert-Smith at 44 snaps, Liam Clifford, who, as we've said, he's kind of a staple, feels like kind of a half starter there because of the way they use tight ends in the slot, 20 snaps. No one else had more than 10 snaps at receiver, folks. Omari Evans, Dante Cephas, Malik McClain, Malik Mega, Caden Saunders, they all played. They were all at 10 snaps or fewer. Daniel, I think we saw a very clear message in a game where you could have done a lot of things in the second half with this game out of hand about what we may see in Ohio State from a personnel standpoint.
Yeah, I think that snap counts breakdown really makes it stark of who Penn State is going to ride in these big games coming up, with Harrison Wallace and Keandre Lambert-Smith separating themselves from the pack, and then Liam Clifford kind of serving as that top slot guy if Penn State goes into a 3 receiver set. Excuse me. But I think the biggest development for the passing game, and I wrote about it a little bit in the story that went up Monday morning, was seeing Theo Johnson, look, like the Theo Johnson that we saw down the stretch last year. He averaged 16.4 yards per catch last year. He came into Saturday's game averaging 8.4 yards per catch, and then did 16.5 yards per catch against UMass. I think that was the Theo Johnson that we got really accustomed to seeing last season. And I think that version of Theo Johnson lessens the need to really lean on those wide receivers a little bit. I think that was something that was missing from the offense through those first couple weeks of the season, where Tyler Warren, I think, has really established himself, and I think that he deserves to be on the field, as a second tight end for as much as he has been. But he's not necessarily that kind of big play tight end. We've seen him as someone that Drew Aller can go to on third downs. He's a a ridiculous red zone weapon. But outside of I forget which game it was last year, either Michigan State or Minnesota, he had the one long touchdown catch down the seam. But that's mostly been Theo Johnson as kind of that big play mismatch threat. And I think that if Theo Johnson is doing that and playing like that, that really raises the level of the passing game and gives Drew Aller someone else that he can give the ball to in space. He can throw the ball downfield to. And I think that kind of can, I don't want to say cover up some of these wide receivers, but it doesn't make it as urgent to get a third and a fourth guy to step up. And that's something that James Franklin has talked about in the past, where they don't look at it as just wide receivers and just tight ends, that they take a pretty holistic look at their pass catchers. And, if the third best pass catcher on the team is a tight end, then he's going to play a lot. But I thought that seeing Trey Wallace get that much run in a first game back after being kind of up and down from a health perspective over the past couple of weeks, I thought that boded really well. I thought that he looked good when he was out there, outside of that fumble, which I think was just a really nice play by the UMass defender, just to be able to get the ball, get a hand on the ball and just really rip it out. And then that drop was a little ugly, but I thought that he looked good. He looked comfortable. I think he had the ball in his hands for a little bit after one of his catches. And so he's someone that we're going to see a lot more of. I mean, I just think that he was so good in that West Virginia game, where he didn't have the big play like Keandre Lambert-Smith did, but he was just moving the chains. He was really steady. He was open. He was reliable. I think that that's the type of wide receiver that you're going to need to keep some drives alive against some big teams, against some good teams coming up. So, I liked what we saw from Trey Wallace. I think that, we're only going to see more of him coming up. And I think that he might be able to change the complexion of this passing game a little bit. But yeah, I mean, you talk about the guys a little further down on the depth chart, though, like Cephas, McLean, those are just kind of tap guys now. I think you saw Keandre Lambert-Smith or Trey Wallace, go downfield and after an incompletion, they come off, that's when those other guys come on. There really was no rotation on Saturday, which, I think that on the one hand, it's, a negative for Penn State, because you really thought that they had the potential to go 5 or 6 deep this year. I think that that's something that James Franklin has really wanted for these past 2 years, and they haven't quite gotten there. But on the other hand, I think that, the fact that they know who they can ride right now, they know that who they can trust and what they can go with. I think that sets themselves up well from a confidence standpoint, going into Ohio State and beyond.
Only 3 Penn State players on Saturday handled more snaps than Harrison Wallace in his return to game action. Venga Ioane, Caden Wallace, and Drew Aller. So welcome back, Harrison Wallace. It seems like he is certainly ready to roll for this offense. What we can make of the rest receiver group, as Daniel just laid out there, remains to be seen beyond him and Keandre Lambert-Smith to this stage. And it was a really impressive ability to spread. By the way, tacking onto that conversation, Andrew Rappleyea played almost 20 snaps on Saturday with Khalil Dinkins missing from action. He was ruled out in the pregame availability report. He's been their number 3 tight end for a while. He's been featured in that goal line short yardage rushing package, the tush push package, as we've called it. But he was not available. We'll keep an eye out for him on practice this week. And in his absence, Rappleyea, top 24/7 prospect in the last recruiting cycle, stepped up and played his most significant role thus far. Game number 2 for him on the freshman season. Mark, you texted me when I was working my way through the snap count details here, and you were curious about what that defensive tackle group might have looked like. And you were right, because you've got to work your way pretty far down the list with what Manny Diaz and I almost said John Scott, Dion Barnes did here with their plan at defensive line was really interesting. Zane Durant and Akeem Beamon, both under 15 snaps on the day. The guys who had more snaps than them at defensive tackle included Caleb Artis, Devon Ellis, who had a phenomenal performance. You had Kozai Izzard leading the way with 30 snaps. But I thought it was really impressive. And when you kind of combine the last few weeks between Durant and Beamon, they are both under 60 snaps. And you can go all the way back through the Northwestern game, which is now 3 different Saturdays with 60 or fewer snaps on your 2 starting defensive tackles. You want to talk about being fresh and in a good situation to attack in Columbus. I really like this approach.
Yeah, don't be telling people what losers we are. Like we're texting each other about snap counts on a Sunday when we should be watching the NFL.
I won't mention that you were texting us about the Eagles.
Okay, yeah,
Oops, I did.
I may be texting about the Phillies when they're playing too. But no, in all seriousness, you made this point earlier in the season when you dial back to last year and you look at the number of snaps that PJ Mustipher was forced to play. And you just got the sense that they weren't comfortable with their rotation. And now it's just like a completely different thing that none of these guys have had to play a tremendous amount. And I think it's particularly important with Zane Durant and Akeem Beamon, because even though both of those guys are like 290 pounders now, they're still not gigantic. So I think to be able to have them fresh for your biggest games, and that's why it's kind of funny to me how Franklin's like, 1-0. We're not even going to talk about Ohio State until Tuesday. They've been gearing up for this for the whole first 6 weeks plus the bye week in terms of what they've been doing with limiting guys. And they've been fortunate that they've been able to do it. I think it's actually been a good thing. I'm not being critical, but it's just kind of funny to me where they're always talking about this one game at a time approach, where clearly there are different areas where their overall strategy was to limit the reps of certain players until you get in to these monster games. And that's what's going to be interesting to watch when they play Ohio State is, okay, you're looking at 14 snaps for Zane Durant and 13 for Hakeem Beamon against UMass. How much does that go up? What is the balancing act going to be? Are they going to play 30, 35, or are they going to play 60? I mean, that's where, and I think it's going to be toward that lower end, because you want to keep these guys fresh, not during the course of the season, but during the course of a particular game that, if you're fortunate to have the lead against Ohio State, as they've had in the fourth quarter, that you're not going to blow it, that you're going to be able to have your best players in there. And that's something that we've seen from Manny Diaz from the time he kind of set foot on campus. It started with the Purdue game last year, and I think we all recognize that. Now, there were positions where they could not do that, but I think when they have this level of talent kind of across the board, that you're going to see them keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, again, no defensive player was beyond 30 snaps here. You had all 3 of those cornerbacks who you started. In this day, Kobe King actually did not get the start for the first time this season. He hasn't really been getting starters volume of reps really at any point this year. But in this case, he actually did not start. It went to Daquan Hardy. Those 3 cornerbacks rarely left the field when Penn State was still in go mode before this game really got out of hand. But you had 4 freshmen, all 4 of those green light freshmen on defense went 20+ snaps. I mean, we've seen some guys here and there go a dozen, go 15. All these guys got some considerable run here before they take on the 6 conference games in 6-week stretch. And just because of how injuries stack up, you don't know when an Elliott Washington or a Zion Tracy or Tony Rojas or a Jameel Lyons. And by the way, Jameel Lyons, so tack on a 5th guy there, another defender from that freshman class. So 5 freshman defenders went 20+ snaps in this matchup against UMass. To be able to do that here in mid-October, and by the way, that's Lyons' 3rd game. And considering the rumblings we keep hearing about him, just wonder if they'll be able to keep him off the field. I know they want to be very strategic in the way they use these freshmen, and they'll continue to do that. But Lions now up to that 3-game mark. Just to finish off the UMass discussion here, it just feels like through the 6-game sample size, Penn State continues to create chaos on defense. That's been a calling card for them, whether it's the turnovers or the tackles for loss. They had 14 tackles behind the line of scrimmage on Saturday, and they're meanwhile been in control on offense. You can say they haven't been explosive. You can say they haven't produced the fireworks, but they have been in control. 7 consecutive touchdown drives on Saturday. On a weekly basis, game by game, they're taking the ball 8 to 12 plays on these touchdown drives. And Daniel, that has been the recipe thus far. I don't think that we necessarily thought this would be what 6-0 might look like for Penn State, but buckle up because Columbus is calling, and then 5 more conference games after that. How much of this 6-game sample size do you think is genuinely what this 2023 Nittany Lions squad is versus how much they may evolve in the final stretch?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely room for evolution, especially from the perspective of they're going to be in closer games. They're going to end up in a couple heavyweight fights, I feel like, especially with Ohio State and Michigan left on the schedule, where you're going to need some splash plays, whether that's from the offense, which we haven't really seen yet, and then defense or special teams, which we've seen a couple times so far this year. So I think that there is like, a lot of room for growth as you go forward, but I just think it comes back to how they are playing really good complementary football. I think that you laid it out pretty well in terms of the amount of chaos they're causing on the defensive side of the ball, and then just how efficient and in control they're playing offensively. I think that is just a very, very good recipe because neither side ever feels like it's out of control a little bit. You've seen the defense pick up the offense at Illinois and Northwestern. There hasn't really been a situation where the offense needs to pick up the defense yet. But I think that, those two, the way that both of those units are playing, I think it puts them into a good spot going into Columbus this weekend. I mean, I think that, when you're playing an opponent of Ohio State's caliber, in some respects, you are going to need to see more from both of those units, just because that's, those are the stakes, that's the talent level, this is the type of game it's going to be. But, I think that from where they are right now through 6 games, I think that, you feel pretty good about it, but, there is going to be some evolution and there is going to be some growth because, someone can break out, someone can fade away, someone can emerge as a big time playmaker, like we just saw Daquan Hardy do on Saturday. So it'll be interesting to see, where we are 6 weeks from now and how things look.
Mark, I'll kind of pose it to you in maybe a different way. Expectations versus reality, September 1st versus October 16th with this team. If you had envisioned they'd be 6-0, what maybe did you think that would have looked like, and versus where we are here?
I would have thought they would have had to scrap and fight in at least one of those games, even knowing what these opponents are all about. And it's interesting because I was talking, and I think we mentioned this, but someone asked me last week, do you think Ohio State has an advantage in this game because they've been in closer games? And I said, I don't know. I mean, every year before this, the last 6 years, Penn State typically has been in a close game or two before going out to or before playing Ohio State, and it didn't seem to make a difference when the fourth quarter rolled around. So maybe there's something to be said that you've been able to win by these margins, not necessarily put everything on tape that you had to put on tape. And going back to what I think is one of the biggest storylines of the first half of the season, being able to keep people healthy and fresh. Going into this final 6 games, again, that they are not going to be blowing everybody out by 30, 40, whatever points, that there are going to be instances where they need their best players in the fourth quarter, and that's how we're going to judge this team. I don't think we can fully judge this team just yet. When we talk about the running backs, and I thought Jaywan Sider made just a great point last week. We could sit here and say there's not been explosive plays from Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, but as Jaywan said, we haven't seen him in the fourth quarter. And where did we see the explosive plays from the running game against UMass? It came in the fourth quarter when UMass was kind of ground down. So I just think that's the big storyline. Let's see what this team is capable of doing. They've been able to, it's kind of like bank all of these extra snaps that you think they can use at some point, Let's see if that really comes into play. And I think that's been the key storyline of the first half of the season going into this monster game in Columbus.
And you explained that just enough where it gave me time to go look up what Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen have done in the fourth quarter this year, because I thought that was a fantastic point from Jaywan last week when he was discussing the ground game thus far. And I'll say it again, they are the number one team in the Big Ten right now in rushing yards per game. It hasn't maybe looked the way we thought it would, but they're there at the top of that list. Nick Singleton so far, mid-season 2023, 12 carries for 48 yards, 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. Kaytron Allen in the fourth quarter here in 2023, 2 carries, 7 yards, no touchdowns. I mean, these are 2 of your top 10 players on the roster, and they've combined for 14 carries in the fourth quarter through 6 games. And I think I read the Drew Aller stat line on our post-game podcast, but I'll do that once more. In the fourth quarter this season, Drew Aller, 8 of 13 for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I figured I might as well look up what his leading receiver has done in the fourth quarter. Keandre Lambert-Smith has been so important for this team. Far and away the leading receiver, 3 catches, 29 yards, 1 touchdown in the fourth quarter. We're 6 games in. I mean, that's how little they've had to mess with their meal in the fourth quarter throughout the course of this matchup. We've got a huge week ahead at Lions247.com, and we've got a lot to learn about this team. So with that in mind, I figured, what's the midseason question that stands out? We talked about this a bit at the bye week. We obviously discussed it in August. And Daniel, we're going to begin with you here, and we're going to finish this segment with that before we talk to Patrick Murphy and get a better perspective on Ohio State. But in terms of where the question mark is between this team actually getting Indy in December, punching their ticket to the college football playoff, what looms largest for you right now, Daniel Gallen?
I think when we did our midseason roundtable, I put special teams down. I think that was partly because I had the third pick on that one. But, I do think that special teams is a little bit less of a concern right now. I think that you're getting some juice in the return game from both Daquan Hardy and Caden Saunders. Can't forget about that 37-yarder that he had in the third quarter against UMass. But I think that it kind of goes back to the wide receivers and the passing game. Yikes. I think I'll go back to the wide receivers and the passing game. I do think we need to see a little bit more out of that. I do feel a little bit better after watching what they did against UMass. I'm a big Theo Johnson guy, and I think that I was really waiting to see that type of performance out of him. And so, kind of like I laid out earlier, I think that kind of lessens the pressure on the wide receivers a little bit moving forward. But, you're going to need to see Keandre Lambert-Smith be a true wide receiver 1 in some of these games. I mean, you're going to need to watch, you're going to need to see Trey Wallace, make some of these plays, make some things happen. To talk about Mark's Eagles a little bit. I mean, you think about watching AJ Brown over these past 4 weeks, and what he is able to do, and just anytime the ball goes to him, he's going to make a play, he's going to make something happen. And while I think Keandre Lambert-Smith has done a lot to kind of assert himself atop the Penn State's hierarchy, you still wonder when the game's on the line, Drew Aller is looking downfield, can he make that play? Will he make that play? So I think that's kind of still what I'm waiting to see, through that passing game.
Mark, same deal for you. What's at the top of the totem pole in terms of question mark for this Penn State squad at 6-0?
Yeah, I think one, explosive plays. Are there things that we haven't seen that they've been able to keep in their back pocket? And then I think from just a broader perspective, how is this team going to operate in the clutch? I mean, it is a fair question. I obviously Ohio State's been in closer games, and what's going to happen when this team's in the fourth quarter of a game where it needs a long drive or where it needs to force a 3 and out? It's not had to do that yet. What is it? Do they have the kind of leadership and moxie and all those cliche things that they're able to pull it off when it matters the most? Because I suspect it's going to matter this week, but if it doesn't, there will be spots as the season goes along where it's going to matter. And I'm anxious to see what this team is really all about. Yeah, we see all these numbers and they're leading the Big Ten and this and that and the other thing. And but how do they operate? That's what the best Penn State teams have been all about. That's what the best Penn State players have been all about. Trace McSorley, he put up a bunch of big numbers in his career, but what do people remember about Trace McSorley? When the game was on the line, that guy got it done. So let's see if this team has those types of players. Yeah, we're looking at a bunch of NFL caliber players. They've recruited extremely well, but let's see what they're able to do in a clutch.
That's where I was going to go.
Sorry.
It's because what I referenced, how little we've seen of some of the stars on this team in the fourth quarter, and you can't penalize Penn State for how they've handled their business getting to 6-0, but I think you can tip your cap or acknowledge at least that Ohio State has faced those moments. They've got a first-year starting quarterback too. He's walked across the coals for a fourth quarter on the road, because he had to. We just haven't seen Drew Aller how to do that. Maybe this is the Saturday that happens. But that's my biggest question. And I don't think that's an unfair one. Like you said, Mark, it's not holding anything against this team. It's just when the spotlight is really shining its brightest, and are you going to live up and look like a championship contender? And you've got to be that individually and collectively. Thus far, they have dominated like the one. But we've got a few matchups here where we're going to really get a chance to pry into the team and their makeup. James Franklin, the staff, what you hear from the facility, all it sounds so encouraging. And that really goes back to when they came back and reassembled after the Rose Bowl. And thus far, you can't really poke holes in that logic. But I think everybody knows it's go for launch time, and it's put up or shut up time. And we're going to get into the other side of that equation right now, fellas, with Patrick Murphy. Appreciate your perspective. See you both on Tuesday at Beaver Stadium. We have another press conference with James Franklin. He says we're going to be allowed to discuss the Buckeyes there. He didn't want to do it in postgame, so expect a lot of coverage on James Franklin, his feedback about what this Ohio State team brings to the field on Tuesday. We're back on the practice field on Wednesday, but before then, we'll catch you with another episode of this podcast. Thanks, fellas. Talk to you real soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. As mentioned, we've got Patrick Murphy, who covers Ohio State for 247 Sports. He's been on this podcast several times in the past leading up to these previous matchups. Patrick, thank you for the time, and welcome to Ohio State Penn State game week. It's a big one that we've both been looking toward.
Yeah, absolutely. You texted me this morning, and we're like, it's that time of year again, and it absolutely is. This should be a fun one.
Penn State, 6-game losing streak. There have been some very close calls, a couple 1-point close shaves for the Buckeyes, but they've found a way to get wins, whether in Beaver Stadium or at the Horseshoe to this point. But these are two different versions of each other every single year. So we're starting to wrap our heads around Penn State. We just spent about 45 minutes breaking them down at 6-0. Ohio State also at 6-0, number 3 in the AP Top 25. Penn State, number 7, of course, both looking up at Michigan, 2-time defending Big Ten champion right now. So how would you gauge where Ohio State is through 6 games, the good, bad, the ugly?
That's a good question. I heard you guys just at the end there talking about how, Ohio State has had one of those big, prime time top 10 games against Notre Dame, but then we saw Notre Dame struggle a little bit the last 2 weeks until this past weekend. So there were some questions obviously about, okay, was that win, did it have the same merit as we thought, or is this Notre Dame team going to struggle? Look, I think that the fact that Ohio State was able to go out and get a win against a program like that on the road in a hostile environment is a positive step for a team, especially offensively, that has some new new players in key places, but this is going to be different. Obviously, this will be at home. I think Penn State presents more challenges for Ohio State. I think this Buckeye team is good for sure on the defense, with the defense kind of carrying the load so far and the offense doing enough, kind of coming alive when it needs to. But we're still waiting to see if this Ohio State team can be a great Ohio State team. And the one thing that I keep telling people is it looks really different in Columbus this year because you're used to these elite offenses. And, some years the defense has been really good under Ryan Day. Some years it hasn't been. This year it's been defense first. And, so there's been some closer games, and it just isn't what Buckeye fans kind of have grown to expect with Buckeye teams under Coach Day.
Of course, the quarterback position, it's been a revolving door of production for Ohio State, and Heisman Trophy contenders and all that. We know what C.J. Stroud accomplished. Now he's an NFL rookie as a top draft pick, and it was a spotlight topic for you guys on your beat all offseason long about what that position would look like here in 2023. And Kyle McCord, who did a lot of good things in Philadelphia in high school, so people are pretty familiar with him, I think, within the Penn State community, has stepped up as the starter. To this point, 64% pass completion, 1,650 yards through the air, 11 touchdowns, 1 interception. That's the stat line. Can you give us the actual anecdotal evidence of what it has looked like and where you think he is in his progression right now?
Still growing for sure. I think I asked Coach Day this a couple weeks ago about how he kind of compares where Kyle is, where with CJ at this point in his career and Justin Fields before that. He didn't want to go into too much, but I kind of looked back. I don't think Kyle has quite reached where those guys were, and maybe he will. I think the biggest thing with McCord is that he's just cool, calm, collected. There's not a lot of things that rattle him. I mean, if you go back and watch the end of that Notre Dame game, his numbers aren't great on that final drive. I think he completed like 5 of 11 passes or something. But, they're down to third down, fourth down once, third down a couple times. He's not rattled. He goes out and makes some big time throws. I honestly think when he doesn't have to worry about thinking so much, when he just kind of settles in and just starts playing, that's when he's at his best. He started slowly 2 weeks ago against Maryland, and I think it kind of got in his head a little bit, completed a few passes before halftime, came out in the second half and was just in rhythm, only threw 3 incompletions the rest of the way. So he's still trying to find that consistency to not kind of overthink things. Maybe Ohio State simplifies things a little bit for him at times, but he's certainly making progress. I mean, if you look at what he was doing week 1 to where he is now, he's definitely improved. Obviously, with the weapons around him, you should be able to put up the numbers like you listed. So there's definitely been progress for McCord. I don't know if he's going to be on that track of Heisman Trophy finalist at any point in his career. He has that potential down the road, but we just haven't seen that consistently enough yet. But like I said, the poise, the calm collectedness is what's really stood out about him.
I'm glad you pointed out the supporting cast, because that's been a common theme for every Buckeyes quarterback going back a while now, is they do have an arsenal of weapons around them. And we know the wide receiver spot has been at an elite level for a while. The conversation starts with Marvin Harrison Jr., who, of course, played high school ball with McCord at St. Joe's Prep in Philly. What does he look like here? There's been so much attention on him leading into the season. How has he kind of converted that into on-field action? And then what else are we looking at around Harrison in this offensive attack that the Nittany Lions are certainly doing their diligence on during game prep?
Yeah, I mean, Marvin's been Marvin Harrison. Teams have doubled him, sometimes 2 guys and a safety over the top. He has had a couple games where the stats don't look as good just because of that coverage or other guys getting open. I mean, Ohio State's been willing, McCord specifically has been willing to go where the ball needs to go. But a lot of times when they need a play, they've gone to Marvin. Now, he is playing with an injured ankle. He hurt himself, as I'm sure people are aware, against Notre Dame. Didn't miss a play, but he said that sprained ankle is he actually played on a sprained ankle last year, still put up the numbers he did. He said this year's a little bit worse, but he's managing through it. I haven't noticed much of a difference. Watching him run at the end of that Notre Dame game, he looked pretty similar to how he looks normally. He's not walking around with a major limp, but he's putting up the numbers I think most people would have expected him to. He did have a few drops or balls that hit his hands. I'm not sure if they classified them as drops against Purdue last week, which was a little uncharacteristic, but for the most part, he's been as advertised. The supporting cast, Emeka Egbuka, he missed last week's game with an injury that he suffered against Maryland. It's still uncertain. I assume that they were eyeballing keeping him out last week with this game in mind, but Ryan Day didn't want to go into injuries after the Purdue game. So we'll see on if Emeka Egbuka is back. We don't even know specifically what the injury is. He kind of got rolled up on the sideline when getting tackled. He's obviously been the number 2 guy, just like he was a year ago. Julian Fleming, another Pennsylvania guy, has played well. He's not putting up big numbers at this point, but that's kind of been what he's done throughout his career, just kind of been a reliable receiver. He's made plays when they've needed him to. They've had to go to a guy like Xavier Johnson, who a former walk-on who's been able to kind of grow into a bigger role throughout his career, with Emeka Egbuka out a little bit more. Carnell Tate, the freshman, played more this week as well, caught 3 passes and had a big play against Purdue. So we could do a whole podcast on the number of guys that could step in and play with Ohio State's receiver room. What it has been, though, and something that's frustrated Buckeye fans a little bit is Brian Hartline stuck with pretty much 3 receivers. They did go a little bit deeper against Purdue, I think, because they got up pretty quickly, but it's pretty much been 3 guys on the field. It's just a matter of, who's healthy and which guys it is for that game. But that's kind of the players you need to know in terms of the receivers.
Harrison, 31 catches, 604 yards, 5 touchdowns. Igbuka, 22 catches, 303 yards, 3 touchdowns. Julian Fleming, the third guy there, 16 catches, 162 yards, no scores thus far. The tight end, Cade Stover, has 23 receptions, 359 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And that offensive backfield, I know there's also been some availability questions there. Can you talk us through what the situation is at running back right now?
Yeah, for a second straight year, this running back room has quickly become a mess when it comes to injuries. So TreVeyon Henderson's the starter when healthy, and he hasn't played the last 2 weeks, despite coming out and warming up. And 2 weeks ago, he was listed as out. He came out for warmups, and we were all very confused. And then last week, he was questionable, came out and did warmups again. And then when they came out for the final warmup, he wasn't in pads. So I think they are probably, again, keeping an eye on this game and knowing they need TreVeyon Henderson. He's been their big play guy, and the running game hasn't been great. I would say it hasn't even been good, mostly because the offensive line has been pretty poor run blocking. They were better against a Purdue team that doesn't defend the run very well this past week. But without TreVeyon Henderson in there, I mean, they had their worst rushing performance in a win against Maryland 2 weeks ago. I think they had 63 yards on the ground in 20 years. So TreVeyon Henderson is kind of covered up some of the issues in the run game. So they certainly need him to be healthy. Chip Tranum has been the number 2. He got hurt, kind of big hit, stood up a little wobbly, tried to walk off and then fell down, probably a concussion. We all assume, though Ohio State didn't want to confirm that. Against Purdue, he left that game, did not come back. Status unknown for him, but he's kind of been the in-between the tackles guy. He scored the late touchdown against Notre Dame on the 1-yard run that won the game. He stepped into that role, kind of pushing out Mayan Williams, who was sort of that number 2 guy last year, who has seen a significant decrease in his number of carries. 2 weeks ago against Maryland, Ryan Day was talking about how he'd had a great week of practice, and we all, especially when TreVeyon Henderson was out, all expected him to take a big jump in terms of his production, and he had 6 carries in the game, 5 of which were late in the fourth quarter. So he was out last week with an injury. So they ended up using sophomore Dallin Hayden, who came on at the end of last year when there were a bunch of injuries, and he had 11 carries for 76 yards and a touchdown. I think he may be their best overall back, but they seem hesitant to just go to Dallin Hayden for whatever reason. I don't know if he has fumbling issues in practice or if he doesn't pass protect the way they want enough. But he certainly runs the ball well. And Ryan Day said 2 weeks ago they were thinking about redshirting him, which is why he hadn't seen much playing time, just given the other guys in the room. Now with these injuries, I wonder if you scrap that plan and maybe just accept that you're going to play him. And he still has 2 more games he can play before he can redshirt. But I think he's going to have to play a bigger role, especially if some of these injuries end up being a little bit longer term.
As I was checking in with the happenings in Columbus this offseason, which we all do at different Big Ten campuses, beyond the quarterback position, it felt like the offensive line was first and for at least second on that list in terms of, okay, is Ohio State can be able to get something together by kickoff? What's it going to look like? What have you made of the offensive line plan so far? And certainly against Penn State team, a team that has racked up the sacks, how do you feel about their ability to protect McCord off the perimeter?
They've been good in pass protection. McCord, I think, has been sacked 5-6 times. It hasn't been a ton. And a couple of those at least have been him holding on to the ball a bit too long. I wouldn't say they are a great pass protection team, but they are certainly good. And that hasn't been an issue. What has been an issue, as I mentioned, is the run game. And Joel Klatt 2 weeks ago against Maryland really highlighted it in the game. It really came to the forefront because of the rushing numbers. They weren't getting the second level. They're not opening a lot of space. It's confusing to me because while they do have 3, first-year starters, and one of them being the center, 2 guards who have a lot of experience, including Donovan Jackson, who a lot of people preseason were projecting to be one of the first guards off the board in the NFL draft next year, a former 5-star kid. I thought they'd be able to run inside pretty well. That has not been the case. Now, Ohio State does like to do a lot of like stretch plays to the boundary and things that drive fans crazy. Those plays have not worked. And I don't know if it's a matter of this offensive line just isn't athletic enough to kind of get to where it needs to be, or they're not reading who to block. I mean, there's been some plays where, 2 offensive linemen are blocking the same guy unnecessarily as they they pull one guy who ends up blocking a guy who's already blocked. And then there's a free runner in. As I said, Joe Klatt was showing how Maryland linebackers were having space to run and stand up the Ohio State running backs at the line of scrimmage. Again, it was better against Purdue this past week. Whether that was a matter of Ohio State's sort of found something. They did simplify the running game a little bit when Dallin Hayden came in. To me, it's probably more a factor of Purdue's struggles to stop the run. They're just, I think it was just easier for Ohio State to get done what they wanted to do. So this will certainly be a test, I think, for this offensive line in both capacities, run blocking, pass blocking. But run blocking is where I think Ohio State fans will be a bit more concerned.
Ohio State ranks number 9 right now among Big Ten teams in rushing offense. Certainly unaccustomed to seeing them that far down the list. As mentioned, Penn State number 1 in rush defense in the conference thus far. Patrick, you've mentioned injuries in a few different spots. That seems to be a bit of a theme. Something we've discussed here with Penn State is how light the workload has been on so many of their primary players because of the lopsided scores. Now, Ohio State has had their share of lopsided scores, but they've had games that have gone considerably more competitive deeper into the second half. Maryland, certainly Notre Dame. And I'd imagine there has been more attrition at midseason for Ohio State than maybe what we've seen here. Where are they? If you're serving up the injury report to us here very early in the week, you've mentioned a few spots. Defensively, are we monitoring some stuff? Anywhere else on offense?
Yeah, most of the ones I've already touched on. The big one on the defensive side of the ball is Denzel Burke, their number 1 cornerback. He left against Maryland, kind of was chasing down a play that got loose. It was tough to really tell what he injured because he got right up and then looked like he sort of grabbed his leg. So maybe it was a hamstring. He also could have gotten his ankle tweaked kind of on the tackle, but went to the sideline and they started to tape his ankle up and then they pulled up the medical tent. So he couldn't really tell what they were looking at. And then he went to the locker room. And at that point, Ohio State was up pretty big. So whether or not, he could have come back in the game and they just decided, let's not worry about it, or if it's something a bit more, but that's certainly concerning if they don't have, their top cornerback against Penn State. I mentioned the other ones, the running backs. I think Travion Henderson will be back. Less certain about Mayan Williams and Chip Tranum. Emeka Egbuka, that's a tough one. He didn't even travel this past week, so whether it's a bit more serious than they initially expected or if that was just precautionary to have him ready for this week. Obviously, I think they understand that they have a deep wide receiver room, but when you're playing in a game like this, I think you want as many of your top guys out there as possible, right? So I hope we get more information as the week goes on, but Ohio State is very tight-lipped about injuries. And I thought Ryan Day was starting to be a bit more loose about it. He talked more about it this year. And then after the game, he immediately got asked about the injuries and he's like, I don't have anything for you. And I was like, well, now we don't know anything again.
Yeah, we're in a similar category here.
Right.
You can respect it mid-season from it's a little frustrating as a beat reporter, but you'd understand why that is the approach on their end. Patrick, I want to talk about the defensive evolution for Ohio State because you talked about that being the unit they've been able to lean on a bit more thus far at midseason. And when you give up 40-plus points in back-to-back losses to Michigan, it's going to be a hot-button topic is defensive improvement. What does it look like this far so far? And what are the strengths that you think are going to be able to show up against Penn State? And what are the more, I guess, the ones that you have concerns, like, is this aspect of the defensive success for 6 games going to show up against Penn State?
So after the Michigan game you mentioned last year, and then that Georgia game in the college football playoff, the big talking point was Ohio State's giving up too many big plays. And Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator who came here before last season, he was a aggressive, at Oklahoma State, at Duke, that, they brought various blitzes and, it worked. And I think that he tried to bring that to Columbus and realized you don't have to do that when you're recruiting 4- and 5-star guys, as opposed to 3- and 4-star guys. You can play a bit of a different defense and the fact that they were burned so bad in 2 big games certainly made him reevaluate things this year. So as much as he doesn't like it called this, they've kind of taken a bend but don't break approach. So, they are, especially against, Notre Dame. It was that way a little bit against Maryland. They're letting teams drive the field a little bit more by kind of keeping everything in front of them. I keep calling it, they're putting a shell on the defense to not allow a big play. I think the biggest play they've given up this year is a 38-yard play. So they've done a good job of limiting everything explosive. And Jim Knowles has had to change that. He's admitted he's not being as aggressive, and it had to be a concerted thing in his head to, not just blitz on various plays. Now, they did do some more of that against Purdue this past weekend, and they do have some stuff in there that, will still be aggressive at times. It's just being more selective with it. In terms of the strengths, the secondary has been very good. If Denzel Burke is healthy, he has established himself probably as one of the better cornerbacks in the country. He was really good, a freshman All-American 2 years ago, didn't have a great season last season while dealing with some injuries and kind of has regained that form. Davis Inigbinosin, who transferred from Ole Miss, is their number 2 corner. He's been pretty solid. He's a very physical corner, so they've played him off a little bit more, I think, to avoid kind of him being handsy and getting some penalties. The safety play has been, I think, better than most people expected. Josh Proctor is a 6th-year guy who's kind of been in and out of different roles throughout his career, has kind of found his spot, had a pick 6 that kind of jump-started things against Maryland a couple weeks ago. Lathan Ransom, who was a starter last year, he was coming off of a broken leg in the Rose Bowl the season prior, and I think throughout the year got better and better, and you're starting to see, kind of what the best of him looks like this year. And then Sonny Styles is kind of their nickel safety. He rotates with Jordan Hancock depending on what kind of offense they're facing. Sonny Styles is a guy from Columbus who's a 5-star kid, real versatile, 6'3", big kid, but can also run. So they use him in a few different ways in kind of that cover nickel safety position. So that's been the strength. They haven't allowed much through the air, even against some talented quarterbacks. The other side of the coin, I would say, is the defensive line has been good, but the pass rush hasn't gotten home much. And that's been a big topic of conversation in Columbus because you've got 2 former 5-star defensive ends in JT Tuimoloau, who obviously Penn State fans will unfortunately remember from last year, and Jack Sawyer, who everyone expected to kind of take on this role of the Bosa brothers or Chase Young. And they haven't really done that because pass rushing isn't really what either of them do really well. And so they've gotten some pressure. And if you look at kind of the underlying numbers, their pressure rate is pretty good, but the sacks just haven't been there. Now, each of those guys got a sack and a half last week against Purdue. Again, Purdue's offensive line, not great, was banged up, got even more injured in the game. So probably more a catalyst of that than like they found something in the pass rushing. But that's certainly an area where, they needed to pressure Sam Hartman. They did a little bit, not a ton. Same when playing Taulia Tagovailoa a couple weeks ago. They got him out of the pocket some, but he was still able to make a few plays. Now in this game, that'll definitely be a topic of conversation given Drew Aller and this Penn State offense is coming to town.
In terms of sacks for Ohio State, you'll find them at number 13 overall in the conference.
Yeah.
That was startling to me. Penn State number 1 in sacks against in the Big Ten right now. So we'll see how that comes out in the wash on Saturday. Special teams, we just spent a lot of time. We didn't think we would be spending as much time midseason on special teams, but Daquan Hardy popped up as a first-time punt returner, took 2 to the house against UMass. So we got something interesting brewing on our hands. Anything we need to know about Ohio State special teams, because when the margins for error are slim in a top 10 showdown, you never know when that phase could be the factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think back a few years ago when Saquon Barkley returned the opening kickoff for the touchdown at Ohio Stadium. These special teams, like in terms of kicking and punting, that's been fine, though. They did miss an extra point on Saturday, the first miss of the year for Jaden Fielding, the first-year kicker. The issues Ohio State has had, and there have been issues, have been returning the ball. They had against Maryland what we all thought from the press box was a fake punt after the first offensive series. Turned out it was just a really bad snap. They don't return the ball well on either kicks nor punts. There was a striking comparison in the Maryland game where Ohio State fair caught a punt with no one around. And then on the next time Ohio State punts the ball, Maryland guys, 3 guys around him, catches the ball and just takes off and picks up like 20 yards. And it's just like Ohio State has all these athletes, all these guys you think would be really good returning kicks and punts, and they hardly use them or they don't use them effectively. And special teams coordinator Parker Fleming has become kind of a, I don't want to say public enemy number one, but Buckeye fans are certainly asking what is going on with you. Have a coach dedicated to special teams and you're not getting a ton of production from it. It's been years. I think 2014 was the last time they had a kick or punt return for a touchdown. And you just think about all the players that have come through Ohio State that on paper, at least, could be dangerous in that capacity. And there have been some good returns in these recent years, but just nothing that had fully taken it to the house. So yeah, I think that's certainly an issue. They've been good on coverage for the most part. Had a couple, get out, like I said, 20, 30 yards, but they haven't let anything go. But they also haven't faced anyone that I think is as explosive as what they will face on Saturday. So yeah, it's been an interesting topic that, like you said, I didn't expect it kind of on the other end of the coin, expect to be talking about all of these issues in the special teams, but it hasn't been clean, I guess is how I would sum it all up.
It's before noon on Monday of a game week. You and I are just embarking on our coverage of what this week's going to look like in Columbus and here in State College, respectively. We're going to hear from our head coaches. We're going to hear from players. We're going to circle up with our fellow colleagues and eventually put our predictions on our respective sites. But I want to pick your brain here. What do you think, to finish off this conversation, is the ultimate X factor for Ohio State in this home game? It's a 4.5-point line based on what I saw the initial post from Caesar Sportsbook on Sunday. So clearly this is one that is expected to go down to the wire. We have seen nothing even close to that for Penn State this season. We all expect to learn a lot about the Nittany Lions. What do you think you'll learn about Ohio State from an X factor perspective?
Yeah, I think it's similar in my mind to what I thought going into the Notre Dame game. Like, can this offensive line do what it needs to do? How do, a young guy like Kyle McCord handle these situations? Now, they went through that game. They got the win. Okay, now you got to do it again a few weeks later against what is a better football team, frankly. How does the offense handle that? And then is the defense as good as we think? That's the big question for me. I think we're kind of asking that every week just because Ohio State's defense has struggled these last few years. Like, is this really what we think? Because at the midpoint last year, I would have told you Ohio State's defense was improved, and then the last few games of the season happened. So I think this will be probably the best litmus test for that group of, okay, can you, I don't expect them to necessarily hold Penn State's offense in check, but can you make the plays that are necessary, maybe force a turnover or crucial 4th down stop, things like that. And obviously the big plays continue to be a concern for Ohio State, even though they haven't given them up. It's clearly in the back of everyone's minds as they get into some of these bigger games, we've got to limit those. And then, on the Penn State side, you guys, I heard talking about it earlier, those explosive plays. Can Penn State hit on any of those against that Buckeye defense? I think those will be interesting things. And I think always in these games, tends to be a player, right, that maybe we didn't see coming, or maybe even a guy that did but does it a different way. Like, I knew JT Tuimoloau could have a big game last year. I didn't expect that. Saquon Barkley, obviously, we mentioned that kick return. He was always dangerous, but that kind of started that game off. Obviously, it didn't end the way Penn State fans want. So, like, who could be that guy maybe? But if we could predict that, then, we could predict the whole game, right?
Yeah, we'll find out about that. We'll get your prediction a little bit later. I'm not going to put you on the spot here on a Monday. We have some written content that we're swapping. Yeah. You'll see a lot of more Ohio State analysis from Patrick up at Lions247.com later in the week. I'm sending some answers his way. I'll be on his podcast later in the week. It's always good to be able to lean on our network partners like this. And one thing I just wanted to finish off here. I know I said that was the last question, but it just came to my mind. We're all watching what Quinn Ewers is doing in Texas, and it's obviously he's got his career going in the way that a lot of people thought he would eventually do. But you remember, he started off in Columbus, and before he reclassified, he was a big reason why Drew Aller wasn't a priority for Ohio State. I mean, I know you don't cover recruiting. Your focus is on the team there in Columbus, but whether it's the fans on your message boards or maybe some people you talk to internally within Ohio State's facilities, is there kind of a sense of what it means to see Drew Aller, Mr. Ohio football of 2021, coming back to town in a Penn State uniform as this, revered first-time starter under James Franklin?
I think if you were to talk to the Ohio State coaching staff, they would say that, that they would have loved to have Drew Aller as a part of this program. Obviously, with the way things played out, it didn't work out that way. I think that the talk would heat up more if Kyle McCord had struggled throughout the start of the season, right? Like, oh gosh, there's this guy coming back, the hometown kid. But this isn't the first time Penn State's come to Columbus with an Ohio-born starting quarterback, right? So now some of those guys weren't ranked as high as Drew Aller. In fact, most of them, if not all of them, were not. So, I certainly think they recognize the talent, but I think you mentioned the fans and the message board. I think the complaining would be significantly higher if Kyle McCord had struggled out of the gates, whatnot. Now, there certainly are fans who still don't buy Kyle McCord just because he hasn't been CJ Stroud or Justin Fields. And obviously the standard at Ohio State's very high. But I don't get the sense that it's like, oh, we missed on this guy. Not because Drew Aller isn't very good. I think he is, and I think everyone would admit that. But I think they also know, okay, we've got Kyle McCord in there. There's still confidence in Devin Brown, who is Kyle's backup, a guy that probably should have mentioned this earlier, did some red zone quarterback stuff against Purdue, something to keep an eye out on if they use that against Penn State. It's an area Ohio State hasn't been strong in this year. But they feel like he will be able to step in, and the pipeline is pretty filled with recruiting. So, yeah, I mean, I think they recognize the talent that kind of got out of the state, but also know, they went into Pennsylvania and got a really good one, right? So it's kind of a give and take. And if things are working out, you don't get as upset about that. But yeah, I thought you were going to ask me if they wanted Quinn Ewers back in Columbus.
No, I was going to go down that road, but I think, to be honest, that question I just asked you is probably better proposed this upcoming Sunday after this game is played, right, and your message board gets a chance to digest whatever they saw, whatever it may be. We know that it's going to be a wild week on your site, on our site over at Bucknuts at Lions247.com. Ohio State, Penn State, excited for it. Patrick, good luck with your coverage, and we'll be touching base throughout.
You too. Thanks.
Great stuff from Patrick. And before him, Mark and Daniel. And as you can tell, as we go to an hour and 15 minutes plus here on our first podcast of the week, we're hyped up for a fantastic matchup ahead on Saturday afternoon. Along the way, we'll have practice coverage, press conference coverage, a bunch of player conversations to share at Lions247 for our VIP subscribers. And there is a key commitment announcement set for Monday evening. In case you missed it, Jalen Harvey, longtime target for Penn State, edge rusher out of Maryland, going to be announcing his college pick. So whichever way that lands, we'll get Tyler Cavaruso on the next episode of the podcast to discuss the impact, the ramifications for Penn State's 2024 class moving forward. There's also a new set of 24/7 sports rankings that saw a lot of movement from Penn State's 2024 recruiting class. Ethan Grunkemeyer into the top 100 at the quarterback spot. Luke Reynolds, now the #1 overall tight end prospect in America and a 5-star. We'll break those down and a lot more in a recruiting segment on Tuesday. We'll also give you our takeaways coming out of James Franklin's Ohio State Week press conference. Plenty to come here on the podcast and at Lions247.com. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching.